That song we just sang, I'm not ashamed to own my Lord. Do we really believe that? Because sometimes owning your Lord can be a costly thing. In 1 Peter chapter 4, the Apostle Peter wrote these words in verses 15 and 16. Well, I'm going to start in verse 12 actually. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you. But to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that also at the revelation of His glory you may rejoice with exultation. If you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. Make sure that none of you suffers as a murderer or thief or evildoer or troublesome meddler. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, he is not to be ashamed, but is to glorify God in this name. For it is time for judgment to begin with the household of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if it is with difficulty that the righteous is saved, what will become of the godless man and the sinner? Therefore those also who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right. That's what it means to own your Lord. Sometimes you're going to suffer for it. Peter says that when you suffer as a Christian, don't be surprised. Don't act like it's a strange thing that's happening to you. Because this is the way of life when you try to live godly in Christ Jesus. And if you do suffer, don't suffer as a criminal, don't suffer as someone who does what's wrong, but rather choose to suffer as a Christian. Suffer because you owned the name of God. Do not be ashamed, but glorify God in this name. Now, why do I say this? Peter would have known, I think, better than most what owning the Lord costs. In Acts chapter 12, we have a story about how Peter himself suffered for the name. That is where we are this morning. Acts chapter 12, describing the persecution from Herod. Now, as we get into this lesson, the main content of chapter 12 is that Herod kills James, the brother of John, and then he puts Peter in prison and he plans to kill him too. And Peter gets a miraculous escape this time. And of course, at the end of the story, Herod dies. There's a piece of background information that I want to include before we get into the text itself, and it regards who Herod is. There's actually several people in the Bible named Herod. Here's a family tree. I don't know how easy it is to read this. But there was the original Herod. We call him Herod. He's sometimes referred to in history as Herod the Great. He was a man who managed to wind up on the right side of every political conflict that took place in Rome. And he was one of the Roman puppet kings. He was not a Jew. He was actually an Edomite. But Herod the Great was responsible for quite a few building projects, including the renovation of the temple in Jerusalem. And Herod the Great is also known as the one who attempted to kill Jesus in infancy in Matthew chapter 2. He's the one who was going around and hunting out all those babies until, of course, he dies and his parents return to Judea and really to Galilee. They try to go back to Judea, but his son, Herod Archelaus, has taken the throne in Jerusalem, and he's probably just as bad as his father's going to be, so they go up to Galilee instead. Now, there's another Herod, Herod Antipas, who he's featured in the Gospels as one of the sub-rulers of Galilee. When Herod the Great died, his kingdom in Palestine was divvied up amongst his sons. They don't call them kings, they call them tetrarchs, which basically just means a fourth ruler, because you only got a fourth of the kingdom. Herod Antipas got the region of Galilee. He's the guy that killed John the Baptist and who Jesus confronts on trial in Luke chapter 23. Herod Antipas also had a brother named Herod Philip. We don't know much about him other than that he got his wife stolen by Herod Antipas. And there was also Herod Aristobulus, who was not mentioned in the Bible. But he has a son named Herod Agrippa I. That is the Herod that we're talking about in this chapter. Herod Agrippa I in Acts chapter 12. He's known to us quite a bit from secular history, and the Jews loved this man because of all of the good things that he did for them. The Josephus, Philo, the Mishnah, the Talmud, they all speak favorably of him. Because, he persuaded Caligula not to build a statue of himself in Jerusalem, for instance. But the Bible does not say good things about Herod Antipas I, because while he was pleasing to the Jews, and the Bible affirms that, he was a persecutor of Christians. And Herod Agrippa I had a son named Herod Agrippa II. They were really creative about naming their children back then. And Herod Agrippa II will be featured later in Acts chapter 26, whenever Paul is on trial before him. So there's that to keep in mind too. But that's just background information. Be aware of these different figures and don't get confused by it. As we get on to that, let's get into the text itself in verses 1 through 5. And about that time, Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. And he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. That was during the days of unleavened bread. When he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out before the people. So Peter was kept in the prison, but prayer for him was being made fervently by the church to God. And here we have a situation. While the apostles are laying hands on people and bestowing spiritual gifts, Herod decides to practice his own form of laying hands on people. Not to bestow a gift on them, but to harm them. For instance, he has James, the brother of John, killed. This is a sudden, unexpected death, showing you how dangerous the preaching of the gospel is. James was part of the inner circle of disciples. James was on Peter, James, and John are kind of frequently mentioned in tandem as that special 3 of the disciples that Jesus shared close events with. James was among those who was permitted, for instance, to witness the raising of Jairus' dead daughter. James was among those who was taken up onto the mountain where Jesus was transformed before the disciples and appeared with Moses and Elijah. James was among those whom Jesus took aside with him when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane and went just a stone's throw away from them, asking them to keep watch, and prayed earnestly to God that the cup might pass from him, if it be his will. And James, who was so close to the Lord, the brother of the disciple whom Jesus loved, is killed. The first apostle to be martyred, as far as we know. In Mark chapter 10, in verses 38 and 39, James and John request of Jesus that they might have opportunity to sit, one at his right hand and one at his left. And Jesus tells them, you don't get it. He says, you don't know what you're asking for. He says, are you able to drink the cup that I drink? Or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? And they said to him, we're able. And Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink you shall drink. And you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized. But to sit on my right hand or on my left, this is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. Well, James gets to drink of the cup Jesus drank of, doesn't he? Jesus took the cup of suffering, the cup of death, and now James gets to drink of that same cup. He's the second person recorded in the book of Acts to die after Stephen. There may have been other deaths, but his is the second explicitly, specifically recorded. But Herod is not done. Oh no. He's just getting started. He's killed off James. He sees that it pleases the people, and now he has Peter arrested. And we're informed this is all going on at Passover. And even though Jesus was killed at Passover, well, we're not going to kill Peter at Passover. We're going to wait until the Feast of Unleavened Bread is over. And then we're going to bring him out to the people. Which is a way of talking again about how he's going to be put to death. And now we start asking ourselves some questions. Because who's Peter? Well, Peter had been in a similar situation to James and John. He had sort of boasted a little bit about his greatness to Jesus at the Last Supper. In fact, he said these words to Jesus in Luke chapter 22 and verse 33. He said, Lord, with you I am ready to go, both to prison and to death. Well, Peter winds up in prison. We start wondering, is Peter going to have a chance to fulfill his boast from the Gospels? Is Peter about to follow Jesus to death? That central figure who has done so much preaching since Acts chapter 2? Is he now going to meet the fate of his Lord? Church tradition tells us that Peter was crucified much, much later in Rome. Some even say he was crucified upside down. And the Gospel of John hints that Peter did in fact eventually die by crucifixion. But here, we're wondering, well, maybe this is the end for Peter. After all, verse 4, he's under lock and key. There's no way out. Herod plans to have him killed after Passover. And to make sure that Peter doesn't get away, look at what he says in verse 4. He appoints 4 squads of soldiers to guard him. Well, squad, in this case, the squad is a tetradion or a quaternion, however you read it in Greek or Latin. A squad was a group of 4 soldiers in this context. It's a very specific number. Which means Peter's being guarded by 16 guys. And they're probably working in groups of 4 in shifts to make sure he doesn't get away. They probably would have rotated shifts during the night so that no one would fall asleep and escape. Why all this? Why so many guards? Well, I suspect Herod knew about the last time the apostles had been in prison. And what happens when you try to imprison apostles? Well, they kind of find ways of getting out. Back in Acts chapter 5, for instance, in verse 17, the high priest rose up with all the associates, the sect of the Sadducees. They were filled with jealousy. They laid hands on the apostles. That's the same language there. And they put them in the public jail. But during the night, an angel of the Lord opened the gates up of the prison, and taking them out, said, "Go stand and speak to this people in the temple the whole message of this life." So they just walk out of the prison. And then in verse 22, the officers who came did not find them in the prison, reported back saying, "We found the prison house locked quite securely, the guards standing at the doors. When we opened up, we found no one inside." Uh-oh. That doesn't look good. Well, I know how to fix that. We're going to chain guards to him. That'll keep him from leaving, right? This is really kind of an overkill protection. Peter is sleeping between 2 soldiers in chains, and there's more soldiers guarding the door. But, verse 5, prayer was being made for him fervently by the church to God. Well, that statement changes everything, doesn't it? That's the line that changes everything. I mean, now you could wonder, what about James? Would James have escaped if prayer were made fervently for him? I don't know. Was there not enough time? Was Herod too quick? I don't know. But one of the major points in this story is about the power that prayer had among the Christians. It says that they were praying fervently. That adverb there for fervently, ektonos. Same adverb used of Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane in Luke chapter 22 and verse 44. He was praying fervently, "Let this cup pass from me." Well, the cup didn't pass from him in the sense that he still died. But he was heard because of his piety. He was resurrected, and in that sense the cup passed from him. But all this to say, prayer is a powerful tool. We're going to see that, just how powerful it is. In verses 6 through 11, it says, "On the very night when Herod was about to bring him forward, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with chains, and guards in front of the door were watching over the prison. And behold, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared, and a light shone in the cell. And he struck Peter's side and woke him up, saying, 'Get up quickly.' And his chains fell off his hands. And the angel said to him, 'Gird yourself and put on your sandals.' And he did so. And he said to him, 'Wrap your cloak around you and follow me.' And he went out and continued to follow. And he did not know that what was being done by the angel was real, but he thought he was seeing a vision. When they had passed the first and second guard, they came to the iron gate that leads into the city, which opened for them by itself. And they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. When Peter came to himself, he said, "Now I know for sure that the Lord has sent forth his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting." There's no way out. So on the night that Peter was going to be brought forward, going to be executed, he's all chained up. There's no escape, and suddenly an angel appears. Oh. The angel shines a light in the cell, and he wakes Peter up. While in a dark cell, light shines to save him. This language of light shining in darkness appears a lot in the Scripture, and here's another example of it. I'm reminded of the words of the psalmist in Psalm 107. Psalm 107 is kind of a neat psalm. It's basically a list of disaster scenarios that God's people get into, and then God saves them and they give thanks to Him as a result. It's a series of repeated stanzas surrounding this theme. But in Psalm 107, in verse 10, it says, "There were those who dwelt in darkness and in the shadow of death, prisoners in misery and chains, because they had rebelled against the words of God and spurned the counsel of the Most High. Therefore he humbled their heart with labor. They stumbled and there was none to help. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble. He saved them out of their distresses. He brought them out of darkness and the shadow of death and broke their bands apart. Let them give thanks to the Lord for His loving kindness and for His wonders to the sons of men. For He has shattered gates of bronze and cut bars of iron asunder." Now you'll notice, well, wait a second. Peter didn't do anything sinful to get put in prison. He was just suffering for the way of Christ. That's true. But the psalm establishes a principle. If someone's in prison, it ain't the fact that there are iron bars there that's holding them in. And the iron bars will not keep them in. If the Lord decides they're getting out, they're getting out. He can cut through the bars of irons. He can shatter the gates of bronze. And if that is true for someone who had committed sins to be put in prison, how much more for Peter, who had done nothing wrong in the first place? But more than that, what God does for Peter physically is something He does for us spiritually, isn't it? I mean, were we not prisoners? Were we not held in the shackles of sin? Were we not trapped in darkness? The people who dwell in darkness, who saw a great light, as Isaiah the prophet says in Isaiah chapter 9. Freed from the shackles of darkness. He's struck in the side. I thought it was interesting. The word for side here is only elsewhere used in the New Testament for Jesus' side wound in the Gospel of John. But there's a difference, of course. Jesus was struck in the side by the soldiers to prove that He was dead. Whereas Peter is struck in the side to show him that he's not going to die. His life is being saved. Peter's instructed, get up, put your shoes on. And the whole time it's happening, Peter has himself one question. Is this really happening? Is this a dream? Is this a vision? Is this an obscure thing? You think about that for a second. Peter is an inspired apostle. If there was anybody who had full knowledge of what was going on, or should have, it would have been Peter. But even Peter, he can scarcely believe he's being released. He thinks this is the end. I mean, this is just a vision I'm having. But, they keep going. They pass the guards. They go out the iron gates. They go into the streets. Some manuscripts add that Peter even went down 7 steps on his way out of the prison. And then the angel departs, and Peter realizes, now I know that God sent me His angel to save me from Herod, to save me from the Jews, to save me from those who are persecuting me. Now I know that the Lord answers prayers. Had Peter prayed about this? We're not told about Peter praying in Acts 12, but we are told about something he said earlier in Acts chapter 4 in verses 29 and 30. When they said together as one with one accord, "Now Lord, take note of their threats and grant that your bondservants may speak your word with all confidence, while you extend your hand to heal, and signs and wonders take place through the name of your holy servant Jesus." The Lord is still taking note of threats. That wasn't something that the Lord forgot about when they prayed in Acts 4. It's something He remembers and something He continues to do. And may I add, the Lord still continues to take note of threats to God's people to this day. But sometimes, now, I don't know any stories of people miraculously getting out of prison. But does the Lord protect His people? Does the Lord care about His people? Absolutely, He still does. That hasn't changed. This inspired apostle who's being busted out of prison can scarcely believe it, but God remembers what was said. His words, "Now I know. Now I know for sure that the Lord sent His angel and rescued me. Now I know." I'm reminded again of the words of a psalm. In Psalm 20, speaking about how the Lord shows loving kindness to His anointed king. If you were in Bible class this morning, you know that being an anointed one of the Lord, that's talking about Jesus, yes, but it's also talking about us. We are the Lord's anointed ones in a sense. So when the psalmist writes in Psalm 20 in verses 6 and 7, these words have meaning for us too. Now I know that the Lord saves His anointed. He will answer him from His holy heaven with the saving strength of His right hand. Some boast in chariots and some in horses, but we will boast in the name of the Lord our God. Some people, Herod might boast in his ability to keep Peter under lock and key, his 4 squads of guards and his chains. But Peter boasts in the Lord his God. Herod will later boast, "Oh, the voice of a God and not of a man." People will boast that of him. Human boasting doesn't get you very far. The people of God rely on Him for salvation. And as God saves His anointed king Jesus from death via resurrection, God saves Peter from death via release. Well, of course, what happens? Well, the aftermath, verses 12 through 19. When he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, mother of John, who was also called Mark, where they were gathered together and were praying. And when he knocked at the door at the gate, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. And she recognized Peter's voice. Because of her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran in and announced Peter was standing at the front of the gate. They said to her, "You're out of your mind." She kept insisting that it was so. And they kept saying, "It is His angel." But Peter continued knocking, and when they had opened the door, they saw him and were amazed. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had led him out of the prison. He said, "Report these things to James and the brethren," and then he left and went to another place. Yeah, you look at that. You know what the disciples' reaction to Peter's release is? Disbelief. Oh, what do we do with that, right? He goes to the house of Mary, the mother of John Mark. This is the first time in the Bible that John Mark has been mentioned, by the way. He's traditionally ascribed to be the author of the gospel that bears the name Mark. He's also featured quite a bit in the book of Acts as somebody who is a companion of Saul and Barnabas, or Paul and Barnabas, and doesn't stick with them quite the whole time, but and eventually creates division between them. Peter actually later refers to Mark as his son in 1 Peter 5:13. I don't know if he was literally his son or not, but he calls him that. The disciples are gathered at their house and they're praying fervently, as we know from verse 5 already. And here they are, and they're praying for Peter's release, and Peter knocks on the door. Knock, knock, knock. And he's greeted by Rhoda, the servant girl. And so Rhoda, she hears Peter, and she's so excited she forgets to let him in. There's a little bit of comic element to this. She's so excited, she's overjoyed, she runs and tells everybody in the house. She forgets to let him inside the house, of course. And of course, all the people that are sitting there around praying, they're too skeptical to believe it's him. They don't believe Peter's been released. Peter didn't believe it was happening, verse 9, when it was happening. They don't believe it's happened after it happens. They're like the disciples who, even after Jesus appears to them, no, this is a specter. This is a ghost. No, here, let me show you. I'll eat something in front of you. Oh, no. We don't. See, even when they see Jesus, some were still doubtful. Some still struggle with it. They had to be forced to come to the conclusion, Jesus is alive. It's kind of the same thing with Peter. There's a repeat of the resurrection story going on here. I think there's an implicit lesson in this, by the way. The The effectiveness of prayer is not dependent on how fervently one believes that the specific thing he's praying for. Think about it for a second. I see this sometimes. Christians will beat themselves up because they can't win this mental belief strength contest that they've got going on in their head. I'm praying for something, but when it doesn't happen, well, I guess I just didn't believe it hard enough. I got news for you. If the power of prayer depends on how hard you believe something, where's the power of prayer coming from? It ain't coming from the Lord at that point. It's coming from your own mental strength, ability to believe stuff. And when Jesus says that you can move mountains with faith the size of a mustard seed, the point of that story isn't that, you guys just don't have enough faith. Your faith is so infinitesimally small, it can't even get to be as tiny as a mustard seed. That's not his point. His point is the size of your faith has nothing to do with it. Prayer is not powerful because of who is praying. Prayer is powerful because of the one we pray to. It's because of the God who answers, not because of how likable the guy who asks is. That's a lesson we really need to learn here. And the proof is in this story. Because they did not believe that Peter would be released. They did not believe that he was released. Even though they were praying for it, they didn't really believe it was going to happen. They just thought the whole thing was ridiculous. But they still prayed for it, and God still heard their prayer. Pray. It's so important to pray. You know what the biggest obstacle to prayer really is? Not praying. That's the real obstacle. Now, biggest obstacle to my prayers, no doubt. There's a lot of other stuff going on here too, of course. It is his angel. That's got to be the most puzzling statement in this story. I have no idea what to do with it. The Bible never affirms nor denies the existence of specific guardian angels. But that's not what puzzles me about this. What puzzles me is, it's his angel, but we're not going to let him in. What? It's just, even if an angel showed up, you'd think you'd let him into your house. Maybe you're afraid he'll burn it down. I don't know. But why not let him in? Perhaps they're driven by some other belief or skepticism. The story is comical in a way. But you know what's amazing about the story? God is still amazing people. Letting him in, it says in verse 16, they were amazed. This is the last appearance of this verb in Acts. Acts has been talking constantly up to this point about people being amazed at God. In chapter 2, for instance, whenever the apostles had the Spirit come upon them and they began to speak with other languages, in chapter 2, in verses 7 and 12, it says that the people were amazed. They had amazement at the lame man being healed in chapter 3 and verse 10 when he was walking and leaping and praising God. In Acts chapter 8, we learn about Simon the sorcerer, a man who had amazed people with his own set of miracles. But when Philip showed up and started performing true miracles by the power of the Spirit, the amazer becomes the amazed one. In chapter 9 and verse 21, whenever Saul is converted and starts to proclaim Jesus in their synagogues, all the other Christians are amazed that God has converted this one who used to persecute the way to the death. And when Peter and his companions were amazed, Peter and his companions themselves, when they went to the house of Cornelius and he's preaching to them, the Spirit comes on them, chapter 10 and verse 45, they were amazed that God had given the Spirit to the Gentiles as well. And you know what is amazing about God is the fact that after seeing all of these things, all of these miracles, all of the power of the resurrection of the dead, all of these things taking place, God still has the ability to amaze people. God still has the ability to surprise people. That is the real amazement. He can amaze us today even. The Scripture says He is able to do above, beyond all that we ask or think. Ephesians chapter 3 and verses 20 and 21. That's the amazement that He has in store for us. The governments of this world, they don't surprise me anymore. But the Lord, He still finds ways to surprise me. Who do you put your trust in to save you? Who do you put your trust in to show you an amazing thing? Trust in the Lord, and He will do that for you. But there's another side to the aftermath. There's disturbance among the guards. In verses 18 and 19, when they came, there was no small disturbance among the soldiers as to what could have become of Peter. And when Herod had searched for him and had not found him, he examined the guards and ordered that they be led away to execution. Then he went down to Judea, Caesarea, spending time there. And, of course, what we see here, unlike the guards of Jesus' tomb, whom the Jews protected, these guards are sentenced to death. When a guard loses a prisoner, his life is forfeit. Sometimes he tries to kill the prisoners to avoid this. Sometimes he tries to take his own life to avoid this. But the guard's death is not the last death in this story either. Let's talk about Herod. Verses 20 through 25. Herod was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and with one accord they came to him, and having won over Blastus the king's chamberlain, they were asking for peace because their country was fed by their king's country. On an appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum and began delivering an address to them. And the people kept crying out, "The voice of a God and not of a man." And immediately an angel of the Lord struck him, because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and died. The word of the Lord continued to grow and to be multiplied. And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their mission, taking along with them John, who was also called Mark. What's going on here? Well, Luke records a historical incident. Herod's vassals in Tyre and Sidon are trying to appease his anger. And he gives a speech and they try to flatter him. Then, an angel already intervened once in the story, so an angel intervenes again. He struck Peter in the side to save him in verse 7. He strikes Herod in the belly to kill him in verse 23. It says that Herod was eaten by worms and died. That's kind of a gruesome picture. What do we do with that? It's similar to the death of Jehoram in 2 Chronicles 21, who basically digested himself, or the death of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who is not mentioned in the Bible, but who is mentioned in 2 Maccabees 9. Very similar deal going on. Someone who persecuted God's people, who was struck with a bowel affliction and suddenly died. The word here for died is unusual. It's not the usual word. It means that he sold out. He put his soul out of him. He gave up the ghost, some versions translate it as. Kind of similar to Ananias and Sapphira, how they were struck dead. But what's interesting about Herod's death is that this is one of those biblical events that we know about from reading past stuff that's not in the Bible. I mentioned at the beginning of this lesson that Herod was well liked. This Herod was well liked by the Jewish people. And Josephus really liked this Herod a lot. He talks about all sorts of great stuff that he did. But even though Josephus is clearly biased against the Christian view, and clearly wouldn't agree with Christianity, Josephus writes this about Herod's death. I want to read this passage. It's a little lengthy, but I think it's interesting. He writes, "Now when Agrippa had reigned 3 years over all Judea, he came to the city Caesarea, which was formerly called Strato's Tower. There he exhibited spectacles in honor of Caesar, for whose well-being he'd been informed that a certain festival was being celebrated. At this festival, a great number were gathered together of the principal persons of dignity of his province. On the second day of the spectacles, he put on a garment made wholly of silver, of a truly wonderful texture, and came into the theater early in the morning. There, the silver of his garment, being illuminated by the fresh reflection of the sun's rays, shone out in a wonderful manner, and was so resplendent as to spread awe over all those who looked intently upon him. Presently, his flatterers cried out, one from one place and one from another, though not for his good, that he was a god. And they added, 'Be thou merciful to us, for although we have hitherto reverenced thee only as a man, yet we shall henceforth own thee as superior to mortal nature.' Upon this, the king neither rebuked them nor rejected their impious flattery, but he shortly afterward looked up and saw an owl sitting on a certain rope over his head, and immediately understood that this bird was the messenger of ill tidings, just as it had once been the messenger of good tidings to him, and fell into the deepest sorrow. A severe pain arose in his belly, striking with the most violent intensity. He therefore looked upon his friends, and said, I, whom you call a God, am commanded presently to depart this life, while providence thus reproves the lying words you just now said to me, and I, who was by you called immortal, am immediately to be hurried away by death. And he goes on and relates this speech further. And you can see that Josephus is elaborating a little bit of this to try to still paint him in a good light. But this happened. And Josephus chalks it up to the fact that he didn't rebuke them right away. When you keep reading, he didn't rebuke them for their impious flattery. They called him God, and he didn't say no. And that alone, he didn't even call himself God. He just didn't rebuke others. But that alone was enough to condemn. Another man of lawlessness destroyed. This is the kind of language that you see all over the Old Testament. In Ezekiel chapter 28, for instance, the king of Tyre makes himself out to be God and is destroyed for it. Here in Tyre, this king is made out to be God and destroyed for it as well. Herod, what is he? He's just another Sennacherib, another Nebuchadnezzar, another Antiochus, another man of lawlessness who takes his seat on the throne of God and portrays himself as being God. And here he is exposed for being the lawless one that he is. Even though the Jews loved him, the Christians saw him for the wicked tyrant that he was. And even though he was able to persecute for a little while, God exacted vengeance. Herod learns too late the consequences of what it means to fight against God. The thing that Gamaliel warned about in Acts chapter 5 and verses 38 and 39. Herod learns that now. But even though this man of lawlessness is destroyed, verse 24 and 25, we learn that the word continued to grow and increase. This brings this section of Acts to a close by talking about growth, as we've seen in several other passages. And, as a side note, we also learn that Saul and Barnabas, who were going on their mission of relief in chapter 11, they complete their mission. They take John Mark, and they go on their way. In chapter 13, we'll focus more on them. But this here, this isn't just one story. This is the whole story. This is the pattern of human history, right here. You know what happens when a human government raises itself up against God's people? They might get away with it for a little bit. But then this happens. You know, some Christians may not physically survive it, like James. But this is the end result. Make no mistake about it. And just as Herod was eaten by worms and met his end, there's a day coming when, there will be a condemnation for all those who oppose the gospel of God. A place where the worms do not die and where the fire is not quenched. The question we have to ask ourselves is, are we on the side of the kingdom of God, or are we on the side of the kingdoms of this world? That's the question we ought to ask ourselves each and every day. And it shouldn't be something that is solely restricted to times of reflection whenever a current event or a crisis causes us to reflect a little bit. It should be something that defines our way of life. Every day, each and every day, we ought to look at ourselves and ask, am I submissive to the rule of God? That's the goal of all these things. Take out your songbooks. I noticed that Dennis picked Who at My Door Is Standing as the invitation song. Or Gail's smiling at me, maybe she picked it, but I guess there's a certain sense in which the folks in this story were asking that. Peter knocks on the door, who's that? That can't be Peter, that must be his angel. But the song itself, of course, is a reference to something that Jesus said in the book of Revelation, chapter 3. In Revelation chapter 3, Jesus was speaking to the church at Laodicea, and he didn't have anything good to say about them. They were a lukewarm congregation. He said, they're so bad, you're neither hot nor cold. I'm going to spit you out of my mouth if you don't get your act together. But he says in verse 20, addressing this congregation, Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come to him and will dine with him and he with me. Even in the midst of a congregation about to be spit out of the mouth of Christ, he offers and extends this message of repentance to them and says, I'm knocking on the door, guys. If just one of you were to let me in, I would dine with him. I would save him. He would have a part in me again. It's the message of all of us. Even if the community around us is about to be spit out of the mouth of Jesus, you don't be lukewarm. You remain faithful to the Lord. He knocks at the door. Let him be part of your life. Let him into your house. Let him into your home. Let him be part of your family. Let him be part of your regular daily existence, because that is who Jesus is. He's not, some person that you come to see, once a week in a facility like this. No, he's somebody that is a part of your everyday life. The defining feature of your existence. Your loyalty to Jesus, our loyalty to Jesus, ought to surpass everything. Even loyalty to the members of our very own physical household. Even loyalty to our own lives. James and Peter knew something about that. We're called to know something about that too. So if you're here this morning and you realize you haven't really let him into your house, he's still outside, knocking on the door, and you're still kind of sitting inside in disbelief, wondering, what am I going to do about this? Let him in, so that he can dine with you, and you dine with him. If there's anyone here this morning who needs to make their life right with the Lord, let it be known. While together we stand and we sing the song selected.